Picture this. A seasoned combat veteran, 23 years of military service under her belt, sits across from a freshman congresswoman in the most powerful hearing room in America. The veteran is convinced she's about to expose a fraud. The congresswoman sits quietly, a blue folder resting on the table before her. In 60 seconds, that folder will contain a document so explosive it will transform not just this hearing, but the lives of hundreds of thousands of military families across America. This is the story of how one classified Pentagon memo turned a political ambush into the most consequential bipartisan victory in recent congressional history. And it all began with what appeared to be a routine oversight hearing that nobody expected would change anything. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and cold in Washington, D.C. By 6 a.m., military families had already formed a line outside the Hart Senate office building, many wearing T-shirts displaying photographs that would make your stomach turn. Images of children's bedrooms consumed by black mold, ceilings collapsed from water damage, electrical outlets melted by faulty wiring that could have killed an entire family while they slept. These weren't photos from some disaster zone overseas. These were American military families, living on American military bases, in housing managed by billion-dollar corporations under contract with the United States government. And for decades, their complaints had been systematically ignored, buried, and covered up. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room filled to capacity before most of Washington had finished their morning coffee. In the front rows sat the families whose suffering had brought them here. Behind them, veterans advocacy groups who had fought for years to get someone in power to listen. In the back, defense contractors' lobbyists huddled together, probably confident this would be just another dog and pony show that would blow over in a few news cycles. Television cameras lined the walls, ready to capture what everyone expected would be a typical congressional hearing. Lots of outraged speeches, carefully crafted non-answers from witnesses, and absolutely no real change to the people actually suffering. But seated alone at the witness table was someone who would shatter every one of those expectations. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas looked unremarkable among the sea of suits and uniforms surrounding her. A freshman representative, barely 2 years in office, facing down some of the most powerful figures in American defense policy. What the room didn't know was that this former civil rights attorney had spent the previous 6 months conducting an investigation so thorough, so meticulously documented, that it would expose one of the most shocking cover-ups in modern Pentagon history. Across from her, preparing for what she believed would be an easy takedown, sat Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, 23 years of military service, first female combat veteran elected to the Senate, a decorated soldier whose political identity was built on her credibility on military issues. Ernst had become famous for campaign ads talking about how her experience castrating hogs on an Iowa farm had prepared her to cut pork in Washington. What made this confrontation even more personal was something Ernst had kept private. Her own daughter, a West Point graduate, was currently stationed at Fort Liberty in North Carolina, one of the bases with documented housing problems. This wasn't just politics for Ernst. This was personal. The issue that brought them together had roots going back decades. In 1996, Congress had approved something called the Military Housing Privatization Initiative. The idea sounded brilliant on paper. Transfer management of military family housing to private corporations through 50-year contracts. Let the free market work its magic. Improve conditions without increasing government spending by leveraging private investment. For the first decade, it actually seemed to work. Shiny new housing units replaced outdated military quarters. Military families finally had modern amenities. Politicians from both parties took credit for this innovative public-private partnership. But then something predictable happened. The initial investment phase ended, and these corporations realized they could maximize profits by cutting corners on maintenance. Why spend money fixing problems when the government was guaranteeing payments regardless of conditions? Why use quality materials when cheap alternatives would last just long enough to avoid immediate complaints? Military families found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Black mold spreading through their children's bedrooms, while contractors claimed it was just surface discoloration. Lead-contaminated water flowing from their taps, while companies insisted their testing showed acceptable levels. Electrical systems so dangerous that families were living one faulty wire away from losing everything they owned, or worse, their lives. When families complained, they faced retaliation. Base commanders, caught between their responsibility to their troops and their inability to break billion-dollar contracts, often pressured families to stop making waves. Service members discovered that complaining too loudly about housing could mysteriously affect their performance evaluations, their promotion prospects, their entire military careers. The corporations had perfected a system of plausible deniability. Maintenance requests would disappear into bureaucratic black holes. When inspections were scheduled, crews would perform just enough cosmetic work to pass a visual check, then abandon the underlying problems the moment inspectors left. They falsified maintenance records, conducted sham repairs, and used every legal and financial trick available to avoid actually solving the problems they were being paid billions to address. For years, military families had been screaming into the void. Local news stories would surface occasionally, but they never gained national traction. The Pentagon's official reports consistently downplayed the scope of problems. Everything was under control. Progress was being made. Just a few isolated incidents blown out of proportion by sensationalist media. But Congresswoman Crockett had seen this pattern before in her career as a civil rights attorney. Corporate landlords systematically neglecting properties while collecting guaranteed income. Vulnerable tenants with limited recourse facing retaliation for demanding basic safety. She recognized the signs of institutional failure masked by bureaucratic doublespeak. So she did something almost unprecedented in modern Congress. She conducted her own investigation, not a staff-driven research project based on existing reports, not a series of carefully orchestrated photo opportunities, a real investigation. Over 6 months, Crockett personally visited 12 military installations across the country. She met with hundreds of military families, not in formal settings with public affairs officers hovering nearby, but in their homes, seeing the conditions firsthand. She photographed evidence. She collected medical records showing children hospitalized with respiratory conditions linked to toxic mold exposure. She gathered maintenance records proving that companies were falsifying repair work. Most importantly, she cultivated sources inside the Pentagon and within the contractors themselves. Whistleblowers who had been watching the systematic neglect for years, waiting for someone with the authority and courage to actually listen to what they had to say. The report Crockett released a week before the hearing was devastating. 63% of military housing units showed evidence of conditions that presented health or safety risks to families. Contractors were systematically prioritizing profits over safety. The Pentagon was not only failing to provide adequate oversight, but was actively misleading Congress about the scope of the crisis. Defense contractors and their armies of lobbyists immediately went into damage control mode. This was a partisan hit job, they claimed. An inexperienced congresswoman trying to make a name for herself by exaggerating isolated incidents. Her numbers were inflated, her methodology flawed, her motivations political. The Pentagon's response was more measured but equally dismissive. They acknowledged room for improvement, while emphasizing all the progress being made. Their official assessment put the percentage of problematic housing at just 12%. Certainly concerning, but nothing like the crisis Crockett was describing. As the hearing began that October morning, the battle line seemed clearly drawn. On one side, an establishment of Pentagon officials and corporate executives with carefully crafted talking points and decades of experience deflecting congressional oversight. On the other, a freshman congresswoman with a folder full of documents and no obvious allies among the committee's senior members. Chairman Jack Reed of Rhode Island set a serious tone in his opening remarks. The readiness of our armed forces depends not just on equipment and training, but on the well-being of our military families. When service members worry about their children's health due to housing conditions, it impacts our national security. The first witnesses were Defense Department officials who delivered exactly the kind of testimony everyone expected. Yes, there were challenges. Yes, they took these issues seriously. Yes, significant progress was being made. New inspection protocols were being implemented. Additional oversight mechanisms were being developed. The department remained committed to providing quality housing for military families. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic non-answers. Acknowledge the problem without admitting responsibility. promise action without committing to specific timelines, sound concerned while revealing nothing that could be used to hold anyone accountable. Throughout this testimony, Crockett sat quietly at the witness table, methodically taking handwritten notes rather than relying on staff. Those who knew her recognized this as a warning sign. She wasn't just listening politely. She was identifying specific claims that she intended to systematically destroy with her own evidence. When the corporate executives testified next, their approach was even more defensive. Representatives from the three largest military housing contractors took turns emphasizing their massive investments in improvements. They cited high satisfaction ratings from resident surveys. They highlighted rapid response times to maintenance requests. They blamed any documented problems on communication issues, unrealistic expectations from military families, or failures by previous management that current leadership was working diligently to correct. Each executive painted the same picture. Responsible corporations doing their best to serve military families while dealing with aging infrastructure, budget constraints, and occasionally unreasonable complaints from residents who didn't understand the complexities of large-scale property management. The questioning from committee members followed predictable partisan patterns. Republican senators focus on contractor assurances and Pentagon improvement plans. Why should we believe these problems are as widespread as critics claim? What evidence do we have that current management isn't addressing these issues? Should we give these companies credit for their substantial investments in military housing? Democratic senators highlighted specific cases of family suffering and corporate negligence. How do you explain children being hospitalized due to conditions in housing you're responsible for maintaining? Why are families facing retaliation when they report dangerous conditions? When will you stop making excuses and start actually fixing these problems? Neither approach seemed to break through the carefully rehearsed responses. Pentagon officials deflected to contractors. Contractors pointed to Pentagon oversight procedures. Everyone acknowledged problems while avoiding specific responsibility for solving them. Then Congresswoman Crockett's time came to testify, and the entire dynamic in the room shifted. Instead of beginning with a general statement about the importance of military housing or the need for better oversight, Crockett started by displaying photographs on the hearing room screens. The first image showed a child's bedroom where black mold covered an entire wall, creeping across surfaces like something from a horror movie. The next showed a ceiling that had completely collapsed from water damage. Debris scattered across a bed where a military family's children slept just hours before the structure failed. Another photograph revealed electrical outlets that had literally melted from faulty wiring, scorch marks spreading up the wall in patterns that fire investigators would recognize as evidence of conditions that should have burned the entire building down. Lead paint tests showed contamination levels that would trigger immediate evacuation orders in civilian housing. These photographs were taken the past 30 days at housing units across 8 different military installations, Crockett explained, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. Each image represents a family serving our country while living in conditions that would be illegal in civilian housing markets. For the next 15 minutes, Crockett methodically dismantled every piece of testimony that had come before. She displayed internal company emails showing maintenance requests being deliberately delayed to meet quarterly profit targets. Supervisors instructing staff to focus on cosmetic repairs that would look good during inspections while ignoring underlying structural and safety issues. She quoted directly from corporate training materials that actually instructed maintenance staff on how to perform visual repairs, making problems appear fixed without actually addressing root causes. Paint over the mold, caulk around the leaks, replace the outlet cover, but leave the dangerous wiring untouched. Perhaps most damaging was her revelation about those resident satisfaction surveys that contractors and Pentagon officials kept citing as evidence that families were generally happy with their housing. The impressive 87% satisfaction rate came from surveying only families who had not filed formal complaints about their living conditions. This methodology systematically excluded the voices of families who had reported serious problems or requested transfers due to housing conditions, Crockett explained. It would be like measuring restaurant quality by only surveying customers who had never complained about food poisoning. She presented data showing that 78% of military families who attempted to report serious housing issues faced some form of pressure, intimidation, or retaliation. Base commanders, caught between their responsibility to their troops and their inability to hold contractors accountable, often found themselves pressuring families to withdraw complaints rather than escalate issues they had no power to resolve. This isn't about isolated incidents or communication breakdowns, Crockett concluded. The evidence shows a deliberate, systematic prioritization of profit over the health and safety of military families, enabled by inadequate oversight and, in some cases, active concealment of the scope of the problem. The room was dead silent. The military families in the gallery sat transfixed. This was the first time many of them had heard their experiences described accurately by someone with the power to actually do something about them. When questioning began, Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama attempted to undermine Crockett's credibility on procedural grounds. Congresswoman, you conducted this investigation without proper authorization from the Armed Services Committees. Isn't this really about generating media attention rather than solving problems? Crockett was ready for this attack. Senator, as the documentation provided to the committee demonstrates, I began this investigation after receiving direct requests from 347 military families who had exhausted all available remedies through their chain of command. The House Ethics Committee reviewed and approved the investigation's methodology before I proceeded. She had covered every base, followed every rule, anticipated every procedural objection. There was no angle of attack that could dismiss her findings as improper or unauthorized. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts took a different approach, asking Crockett to elaborate on the financial mechanisms that created incentives for neglect. This gave Crockett the opportunity to explain how the contractual structure actually rewarded companies for deferring maintenance while continuing to collect guaranteed income from military housing allowances. These contracts effectively turned necessary repairs into optional expenses that reduced profit margins, she explained. Companies discovered they could maximize returns by performing the minimum maintenance necessary to avoid contract termination while pocketing the difference between actual costs and guaranteed payments. Throughout the questioning, Crockett maintained a calm, factual approach. She avoided partisan framing, refused to take political bait, and focused relentlessly on specific evidence that witnesses couldn't easily evade or explain away. This made it nearly impossible for critics to dismiss her findings as politically motivated, particularly since her investigation had uncovered problems that spanned both Republican and Democratic administrations. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Senator Joni Ernst turned to question this freshman congresswoman who was challenging the entire military housing establishment. Ernst's reputation preceded her into every hearing room. 23 years of military service, combat deployment to Iraq, the kind of military credibility that could make or break political careers with a single soundbite. When Ernst questioned someone's claims about military readiness or treatment of service members, the political world listened. Congresswoman Crockett, Ernst began, her tone skeptical and slightly condescending, you've painted a very dramatic picture today, but I'm concerned about the methodology behind your investigation. Did you make any effort to verify these families' claims before presenting them as fact? It was a reasonable question that most witnesses would struggle to answer convincingly. How do you independently verify hundreds of individual cases across multiple states? How do you separate legitimate complaints from exaggerated grievances? But Crockett had anticipated this line of attack too. Yes, Senator, every case in my report includes independent verification through multiple sources. We consulted with licensed home inspectors, environmental testing companies, medical professionals, and military housing experts to confirm each claim before inclusion. Ernst nodded, perhaps slightly surprised by the thoroughness of the response, then shifted to a different angle. You've criticized the Pentagon's oversight, but isn't it true that the current administration has allocated fewer resources to housing inspections than the previous one? It was a clever attempt to turn the issue into a partisan talking point about Democratic versus Republican priorities for military spending. But again, Crockett was prepared. The data doesn't support that conclusion, Senator. Inspection funding has actually increased by 14% over the past 2 years. But the internal documents show that inspection protocols were modified to focus on cosmetic issues rather than structural or environmental hazards. The problem isn't funding levels, but how those resources are being directed. Ernst's expression hardened slightly as her initial lines of questioning failed to find vulnerabilities in Crockett's preparation. She had come into this hearing expecting to expose a partisan attack disguised as oversight. Instead, she was facing someone who had done her homework better than most senior members of Congress. Then, Ernst moved to what appeared to be her prepare gotcha moment. The kind of dramatic confrontation that would make headlines and definitively settle the question of whether Crockett's investigation had any credibility. "Congresswoman Crockett," Ernst said, leaning forward into her microphone with the confidence of someone about to land a killing blow. "Let's be honest here. You're deliberately misleading the American people with fictional numbers to push your agenda." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. The packed gallery fell completely silent. Republican senators nodded in agreement, recognizing that their most credible military voice was about to destroy the credibility of this troublesome freshman congresswoman once and for all. Ernst continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for military families through decades of service. "Your report claims that 63% of military housing units have dangerous living conditions," she said, making air quotes with her fingers to emphasize her skepticism. "That's a blatant fabrication designed to generate headlines. The Pentagon's official assessment puts that number at just 12%. You're exaggerating by over 500% to advance your political narrative." It was the perfect political moment. A decorated combat veteran catching a House Democrat in an apparent lie about military readiness. The kind of exchange that would be replayed on news shows for weeks, cementing Ernst's reputation as a defender of military integrity while destroying Crockett's credibility on military issues. The gallery tensed. Camera operators zoomed in, sensing they were about to capture a career-defining moment. Republican senators prepared to follow up with their own attacks once Ernst had delivered the decisive blow. But Congresswoman Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't stammer or attempt to defend her numbers with complex explanations. She didn't show any of the signs of someone who had been caught in a fabrication. Instead, she calmly opened a blue folder that had been sitting on the table in front of her throughout the entire hearing. Without saying a word, she removed a single document and slid it into the projector beside her witness chair. The room gasped collectively as the screen displayed an internal Pentagon memorandum marked "Classified" at the top, with the Department of Defense letterhead clearly visible. The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the massive hearing room. "Senator Ernst," Crockett began, her voice measured and respectful, showing none of the triumph that lesser politicians might have displayed at such a moment. "This is the Pentagon's actual internal assessment from 3 months ago, which I obtained through a whistleblower. Page 4, paragraph 2 states, and I quote, approximately 67% of family housing units across all branches show evidence of conditions that present health or safety risks as defined by CDC standards." She looked directly at Ernst, her expression serious but not hostile. "The 12% figure you cited is from a public-facing report that, as this memo acknowledges, was deliberately adjusted downward to, quote, avoid potential impacts to recruitment and congressional funding discussions." The silence in the hearing room lasted several seconds that felt like hours. Ernst's expression froze somewhere between shock and disbelief. For perhaps the first time in her Senate career, one of the chamber's most respected military voices had no immediate response. The classified Pentagon memo didn't just vindicate Crockett's statistics. It revealed an intentional effort by the Defense Department to mislead Congress about the scope of the crisis facing military families. The very institution Ernst had served for 23 years had been lying to her and her colleagues about the welfare of the troops they claimed to support. Chairman Reed finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications of what had just been revealed. "Congresswoman Crockett, I need to clarify something. You're presenting what appears to be a classified document. Can you explain how this was obtained and whether it has been properly declassified for this setting?" It was a legitimate procedural concern that could potentially undermine even the most explosive evidence. If Crockett had mishandled classified information or violated security protocols, everything she had presented could be dismissed regardless of its accuracy. But once again, Crockett was completely prepared. "Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your concern for proper procedures. This document was officially declassified yesterday through the appropriate channels. I have the declassification authorization signed by the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, which I provided to committee staff. She produced another document from her folder. Additionally, I have here the official acknowledgement from the Department of Defense confirming the document's authenticity and declassification specifically for the purposes of this hearing. The whistleblower who initially brought this document forward followed all proper procedures under federal whistleblower protection laws. Reed examined the paperwork carefully, understanding that the entire hearing's credibility hung on this procedural question. After what seemed like an eternity, he nodded. The documents appeared to be in order. Please continue. This brief procedural exchange was absolutely critical. It established that Crockett had not only obtained devastating evidence, but had followed every rule and regulation in bringing it forward. There was no angle of attack that could dismiss her revelations as improper or unauthorized. Ernst, having recovered her composure but clearly struggling to process what she had just learned, tried a different approach. Congresswoman, even accepting these numbers as accurate, isn't it misleading to suggest that all these housing units have severe problems? Surely there's a spectrum of issues here, many of which might be minor maintenance concerns rather than serious safety hazards. It was actually a reasonable question that gave Crockett an opportunity to demonstrate the depth and sophistication of her investigation even further. You're raising an important distinction, Senator, Crockett acknowledged, showing the kind of respectful, legitimate questions that have been missing from most congressional hearings in recent memory. The internal Pentagon assessment categorizes conditions across 4 levels of severity. The 67% figure includes only categories 3 and 4, defined as conditions that present substantial risk to occupant health or safety, or conditions that present immediate risk requiring unit evacuation. She displayed another slide showing the breakdown of conditions by severity level. According to the Pentagon's own assessment, 29% of units have Category 3 conditions, including extensive mold contamination, lead paint exposure, or major electrical hazards that could cause fires. Another 38% have Category 4 conditions that technically require immediate evacuation, including structural dangers, severe toxic mold exposure, or exposed asbestos. The numbers were staggering, but Crockett wasn't finished. Yet only 2% of affected families have actually been relocated from units identified as requiring immediate evacuation. We have thousands of military families living in conditions that the Pentagon's own experts say present immediate risks to their health and safety. Ernst's expression changed subtly as the full scope of the crisis became clear. As a military veteran and the mother of a service member, the detailed breakdown of safety risks was clearly affecting her on a personal level. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted noticeably from skeptical interrogation to genuine concern. Congresswoman, assuming these assessments are accurate, why wouldn't base commanders be taking immediate action to protect these families? That doesn't align with the military leadership values I experienced in my 23 years of service. It was no longer an attack disguised as a question. Ernst was genuinely trying to understand how the military she had devoted her life to could allow such conditions to persist for military families. Senator, that's precisely the question that drove my investigation, Crockett replied, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their exchange. What we found was a complex system where accountability is diffused across military chains of command, contractor management, and Pentagon oversight, creating situations where no single entity has both the responsibility and authority to force immediate action. She displayed an organizational chart showing the fragmented accountability structure that had allowed this crisis to fester. Base commanders often lack authority to withhold payments or terminate contracts with housing providers, regardless of conditions. Housing contractors report to corporate headquarters rather than military leadership, and Pentagon housing officials are typically focused on contract compliance rather than actual living conditions. Ernst studied the chart, her military experience allowing her to immediately recognize the command structure problems it revealed. So we have a situation where everyone can point to someone else as a responsible party and nothing gets fixed. Exactly, Senator. And the families suffering the consequences have no effective recourse when the system fails them. Something remarkable was happening in the hearing room. What had begun as a confrontational political exchange was transforming into a substantive discussion between two serious legislators about systemic problems and potential solutions. Ernst, rather than continuing to challenge Crockett's credibility, began asking detailed questions about specific failures in the oversight system. For the next 20 minutes, Ernst and Crockett engaged in what could only be described as a collaborative dialogue. Ernst shared insights from her military experience about communication breakdowns between base operations and Pentagon leadership. Crockett outlined specific contractual clauses that limited accountability and proposed concrete amendments to strengthen oversight mechanisms. Other senators noticed this unprecedented shift and began adjusting their own questioning accordingly. Instead of partisan talking points designed for cable news soundbites, the discussion increasingly focused on practical solutions. How could contract be modified to create better incentives for maintenance? What accountability mechanisms were missing from current oversight? How could military families be protected from retaliation when reporting dangerous conditions? As the hearing approached its scheduled conclusion, Ernst did something that shocked everyone who had been following her political career. "Mr. Chairman, before I yield back my time, I'd like to say something." She turned toward Crockett, and cameras zoomed in to capture what everyone assumed would be a final attempt to score political points. Instead, Ernst delivered one of the most remarkable statements in recent congressional history. "Congresswoman, I came into this hearing with certain preconceptions about your investigation and its motivations. I believe you were exaggerating problems to advance a partisan agenda. I now believe I was wrong." The admission, delivered with the same directness that had characterized her military service, caught everyone by surprise. In the hyper-partisan environment of modern Congress, senior members simply didn't acknowledge being wrong about major issues, particularly in such a public forum. "The evidence you presented today is compelling and deeply troubling," Ernst continued. "As someone who has worn a uniform and commanded troops, I find it unacceptable that military families are living in these conditions while serving our nation. Whatever our political differences might be on other issues, I think we can agree that the situation demands immediate bipartisan action." She looked around at her fellow committee members, her voice carrying the authority of someone speaking from deep personal conviction. "This isn't about politics or partisanship. This is about keeping our promise to the men and women who risk their lives for our country. Their families deserve safe, healthy housing. Period." The gallery erupted in applause, primarily from military families who have been sitting through hours of testimony, waiting for someone in power to acknowledge their suffering and commit to actually doing something about it. Chairman Reed allowed the moment to continue rather than immediately calling for order, recognizing the significance of what had just occurred. When Crockett responded, she matched Ernst's bipartisan tone while avoiding any hint of political triumphalism. "Thank you, Senator. I couldn't agree more. This isn't a Democratic or Republican issue. It's about fulfilling our obligations to military families who have already sacrificed so much in service to our country. I would welcome the opportunity to work with you and any interested colleagues on both sides of the aisle to craft solutions that actually fix these problems rather than just creating more reports and recommendations that gather dust on shelves." As the hearing concluded, something unusual happened that cameras throughout the room captured, but few political observers knew how to interpret. Rather than immediately leaving as high-ranking members typically do, Senator Ernst approached Congresswoman Crockett. Away from the microphones, but in full view of the press, Ernst asked to review some of Crockett's documentation more closely. The two women, political opposites in almost every way, representing different parties, different regions, different generations of public service, stood side by side examining evidence and exchanging perspectives about potential solutions. For the military families in attendance, this unexpected collaboration represented something they rarely saw in Washington: the possibility that their living conditions might actually improve because two capable legislators from opposite parties had decided to put problem-solving above political positioning. Outside the hearing room, reporters swarmed both women, searching for signs of the partisan conflict they had expected to define the day's coverage. Instead, they witnessed something far more newsworthy: the beginning of what would become the most significant bipartisan legislative effort to address military family welfare in decades. The impact of the hearing extended far beyond that October day in Washington. Within hours, video clips of the exchange between Ernst and Crockett had gone viral across social media platforms. The moment when Crockett revealed the classified Pentagon memo became one of the most watched congressional hearing clips in years, particularly among military families who finally felt someone in power understood what they had been enduring. For political observers accustomed to seeing members of Congress talk past each other without ever acknowledging facts that contradicted their predetermined positions, the exchange offered a rare glimpse of how government oversight should ideally function: evidence-based, substantive, and ultimately focused on solving real problems rather than scoring political points. The immediate practical impact came just 3 days later when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the formation of a military housing emergency response team with unprecedented authority to inspect housing units, order immediate repairs, relocate affected families, and withhold payments to contractors for unresolved health and safety violations. The announcement specifically credited the compelling evidence presented at the recent Senate hearing as the catalyst for this urgent action. Even more surprisingly, Senator Ernst and Congresswoman Crockett announced a joint legislative initiative the following week. The Military Housing Accountability Act, introduced simultaneously in both chambers, proposed the most significant reforms to the privatized military housing system since its creation in the 1990s. The bill created an independent inspector general specifically for military housing oversight, established clear health and safety standards with mandatory compliance timelines, empowered base commanders to withhold payments for unresolved violations, implemented a comprehensive tenant bill of rights with real enforcement mechanisms, required contractors to maintain sufficient maintenance reserves for emergency repairs, and provided robust protections for military families against retaliation for reporting problems. What made the legislation particularly noteworthy was its unprecedented bipartisan co-sponsorship. In the Senate, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats joined Ernst as original co-sponsors. In the House, Crockett secured similar bipartisan support, including from several veterans serving in Congress from both parties. The military housing contractors initially mobilized their substantial lobbying operations to oppose the legislation, activating relationships built through years of campaign contributions, and warning about potential cost increases that could affect military readiness budgets. However, their position weakened considerably when major media outlets published follow-up investigations using Crockett's evidence as a starting point, revealing problems even more extensive than the hearing had covered. Most damaging to the contractors' opposition was the emergence of additional whistleblowers throughout the Pentagon and contractor organizations. Inspired by the serious treatment of evidence at the hearing and protection offered to the original whistleblower, military housing officials and contractor employees began coming forward with their own documentation of systematic problems. One particularly devastating revelation came from a mid-level manager at a major housing contractor who provided internal communications explicitly instructing staff to address only visible cosmetic issues while deferring substantive repairs whenever possible to maintain quarterly profit targets. The email showed corporate executives celebrating cost savings achieved by ignoring structural and environmental hazards that didn't affect the visual appearance of housing units. Faced with mounting evidence and unusual bipartisan momentum, the legislation moved through Congress with remarkable speed. Just 4 months after the hearing that started it all, the Military Housing Accountability Act passed the Senate 89-11 and the House 376-57, demonstrating overwhelming bipartisan support in both chambers. President Biden signed the legislation into law at a ceremony attended by military families affected by housing issues, with both Ernst and Crockett standing behind him as visual symbols of how substantive cooperation could achieve meaningful results even in an era of divided government. For the military families who had suffered in dangerous housing conditions for years, the impact was both immediate and transformative. The emergency response team completed comprehensive inspections of all units identified as high risk within 60 days, resulting in over 14,000 families being either relocated to safe housing or having emergency repairs completed to bring their units up to acceptable safety standards. The new oversight mechanisms created by the legislation ensured these weren't just temporary fixes designed to quiet political pressure, but the beginning of systematic improvements that would prevent similar crises from developing in the future. Beyond the practical impact on military housing, the Ernst-Crockett Exchange became a case study in effective congressional oversight and bipartisan problem-solving that was incorporated into political science curricula at universities nationwide. Professors pointed to several key elements that made it an exceptional example of how democratic institutions should function at their best. Crockett's meticulous evidence-based approach that focused on documented facts rather than partisan rhetoric. Ernst's willingness to engage with evidence that contradicted her initial assumptions and acknowledge when she had been wrong. Both legislators' ability to shift from confrontation to collaboration once the facts were clearly established. Their focus on constructive solutions rather than assigning partisan blame for past failures. And most importantly, the tangible, measurable results achieved through their bipartisan cooperation. For Senator Ernst, the episode actually enhanced her reputation as a principled conservative leader willing to follow evidence, even when it led to uncomfortable conclusions about institutions she had devoted her life to serving. In media interviews following the legislation's passage, she spoke candidly about the experience. Sometimes in Washington, we get so caught up in partisan positioning and protecting our political allies that we forget why we're really here, to serve the American people, she told a Sunday morning talk show host. Working with Congresswoman Crockett reminded me that good ideas and important information don't belong exclusively to one party. When we focus on solving real problems affecting real families, we can find common ground without compromising our core principles. For Congresswoman Crockett, the Military Housing Initiative became a signature achievement that established her reputation as a serious legislator capable of conducting thorough oversight and building bipartisan coalitions around complex issues. Rather than being defined simply as another partisan voice in an increasingly polarized Congress, she had demonstrated effectiveness that transcended ideological lines. The success gave her the political capital and credibility to take on additional oversight projects with a level of authority unusual for a relatively junior member of Congress. Committee chairs from both parties began seeking her participation in bipartisan investigations, recognizing that her methodical approach and evidence-based conclusions could provide cover for politically difficult but necessary reforms. Perhaps most significantly, their collaboration created a template for congressional oversight that other members began to emulate consciously. Several committee chairs and ranking members explicitly referenced the Ernst Crockett approach when announcing new bipartisan investigations into issues ranging from prescription drug pricing to infrastructure project management to veterans' health care delivery. 1 year after the hearing that transformed both their careers and thousands of military families' lives, Ernst and Crockett co-authored an opinion piece for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes, reflecting on what they had accomplished together and what challenges remained to be addressed. We come from different states, represent different parties, and bring different life experiences to our service in Congress, they wrote. We disagree on many important issues facing our nation, from tax policy to healthcare to immigration. But we discovered that when we focus on specific problems affecting real people's lives, we can find substantial common ground without compromising the principles that define. The old model was about who you knew, explained one veteran lobbyist. The new model is about whether you can defend your positions under scrutiny. Crockett changed the game permanently. Several major lobbying firms collapsed entirely when clients realized their representatives couldn't withstand the new standard of accountability. Smaller firms that specialize in consistent, principled advocacy suddenly found themselves in high demand as corporate clients sought representatives who could survive Crockett-style questioning. The transformation extended beyond just preparation and consistency. The very culture Washington began to shift as the Old Boys Network found itself increasingly vulnerable to systematic exposure. Young lawmakers, particularly women and minorities, began arriving in Washington with teams of researchers and databases of contradictions, ready to challenge any witness who underestimated them. The Crockett generation of politicians brought a fundamentally different approach to congressional hearings. Instead of relying on staff-prepared questions and traditional political theater, they came armed with comprehensive research and the skills to use it effectively. Committee hearings became less predictable and more dangerous for unprepared witnesses. Corporate executives began declining invitations to testify before certain committees, knowing that they faced lawmakers who had been trained in Crockett's methods. Some companies started sending teams of lawyers instead of executives, hoping that legal training would better prepare their representatives for sophisticated questioning. The media coverage of congressional hearings changed dramatically as well. Instead of focusing on political theater and partisan exchanges, reporters began analyzing the quality of preparation and the effectiveness of questioning techniques. Crockett scores became a common way to evaluate congressional performances, measuring how effectively lawmakers exposed contradictions and held witnesses accountable. C-SPAN saw viewership of congressional hearings increase by 300% as the public became fascinated by these methodical exposures of corporate hypocrisy. The network began offering special programming that analyzed questioning techniques and explained the research methodologies behind major confrontations. International observers continue to study the American phenomenon with growing interest. The European Parliament implemented new rules requiring witnesses to disclose any contradictory positions they had taken in other forums. The British House of Commons began training MPs in systematic questioning techniques based on Crockett's methods. Parliamentary systems around the world started adopting similar approaches to corporate accountability. The Canadian Parliament created a centralized database of corporate testimony that could be searched for contradictions. The Australian Senate implemented rules requiring companies to explain any inconsistencies in their positions before being allowed to testify. Academic institutions scrambled to adapt their curricula to this new reality. Business schools began teaching courses on integrated communication strategy that emphasized the importance of consistency across all public statements. Law schools expanded their trial advocacy programs to include training for legislative hearings and regulatory proceedings. Public policy schools created entirely new programs focused on legislative accountability and systematic research methods. Students learned to build comprehensive databases, identify patterns of contradiction, and present findings with maximum impact. Crockett studies became a legitimate academic discipline practically overnight. The effects rippled through civil society as well. Advocacy groups and nonprofit organizations began adopting similar research methodologies to hold corporations and politicians accountable. Environmental groups compiled comprehensive databases of energy company statements on climate change. Consumer advocates tracked pharmaceutical company positions on drug pricing. Labor unions documented corporate testimony on worker safety and wages. These organizations discovered that the systematic approach pioneered by Crockett was incredibly effective at generating media attention and public support. Video compilations showing corporate contradictions became viral content that could generate millions of views and significant public pressure. The Sierra Club's systematic exposure of ExxonMobil's contradictory statements on climate science generated more media coverage than any traditional advocacy campaign they had ever conducted. The methodology allowed them to present irrefutable evidence of corporate deception rather than relying on philosophical arguments about environmental protection. Public Citizen's comprehensive database of pharmaceutical company contradictions became a standard reference for journalists and policymakers. Their ability to instantly provide documented evidence of corporate hypocrisy transformed them from just another advocacy group into an essential source of information for anyone covering healthcare policy. Labor unions found the approach particularly effective when dealing with corporate claims about worker safety and compensation. The AFL-CIO's systematic documentation of corporate contradictions on workplace safety became crucial evidence in multiple regulatory proceedings and congressional hearings. The transformation affected political campaigns as well. Opposition research firms began offering Crockett packages, comprehensive compilations of a candidate's contradictory statements organized for maximum impact during debates or public appearances. The ability to systematically expose inconsistencies became a crucial campaign skill. Debate preparation evolved to include extensive contradiction research and defense strategies. Candidates began spending more time ensuring consistency in their positions than developing new policy proposals. Campaign managers recognized that a single well-documented contradiction could end a political career in the age of viral videos and social media. Political consultants found themselves in high demand for consistency auditing services, reviewing years of a candidate's statements to identify potential vulnerabilities. These audits became so comprehensive that some candidates changed long-held positions rather than try to defend contradictions that had accumulated over years of political evolution. The primary election process became particularly treacherous as candidates faced voters armed with comprehensive databases of their past statements. Town halls and candidate forums became exercises in defending consistency rather than promoting new ideas. Even local politics felt the impact. City council candidates found themselves facing voters who would compile their statements from multiple neighborhood meetings and public forums. School board elections became contests of documented consistency as parents applied Crockett-style research to candidates' educational philosophies. The transformation of American political discourse was profound and permanent. The old system that had allowed politicians and corporate representatives to say whatever was convenient for each audience was dead. In its place emerged a new standard of accountability that valued consistency, preparation, and intellectual honesty above traditional political skills. Museums began collecting artifacts from the Crockett hearing as historical items representing a turning point in American democracy. The Smithsonian acquired the original documents she had used to expose Brown's contradictions, displaying them as examples of how individual preparation could challenge institutional power. Political historians began studying the hearing as a watershed moment comparable to other famous congressional confrontations. Academic conferences devoted entire sessions to analyzing the long-term implications of what became known as the Crockett Revolution. The woman who had simply done her homework and refused to be intimidated had accidentally triggered a fundamental transformation in how power operates in America. Her 5 minutes of methodical questioning had created a new standard that would influence political discourse for generations to come. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire phenomenon was how it emerged from the most basic democratic principles: that elected representatives should hold powerful interests accountable, that consistency matters more than connections, and that thorough preparation can overcome any attempt at intimidation. Jasmine Crockett had reminded America that democracy works best when its representatives do their homework, stand for principles, and refuse to be impressed by expensive suits and condescending attitudes. In exposing Joe Brown's contradictions, she had exposed something much larger: the entire system of influence peddling that had operated without real scrutiny for decades. The reverberations continue to this day. Every corporate executive preparing for congressional testimony, every lobbyist crafting talking points, every politician taking a public position knows they must be prepared to defend their consistency under the most rigorous scrutiny imaginable. The lesson of that remarkable day remains crystal clear. In American democracy, preparation beats intimidation, truth defeats arrogance, and a well-prepared public servant armed with facts can still change the world in 5 minutes of systematic questioning. The story of Jasmine Crockett's destruction of Joe Brown isn't just about one hearing or one political moment. It's about the enduring power of democratic accountability and potential that exists when ordinary citizens, even those dismissed as too young, too inexperienced, or too idealistic, refuse to be intimidated by power and do the hard work of holding that power accountable. In the end, the most devastating weapon in Crockett's arsenal wasn't her legal training or her political instincts. It was her absolute commitment to the truth and her willingness to do the unglamorous work of research and preparation that democracy requires to function properly. That commitment transformed not just her own career, but the entire landscape of American political accountability. And it all began with a simple decision. When faced with a bully who expected her to back down, Jasmine Crockett chose instead to do her homework.